welcome back to the United Stand. I am joined with transfer expert and the amazing journalist Ben Jacobs. Thank you very much for joining us, Ben. A really disappointing weekend for all Manchester United fans, and that has led to a lot of talk about Ruben Amorim's future in the Manchester United job. You know, we're 10 months in now. There's been a lot of different reports about the amount of pressure he's under, about payments that would have to be made if he was removed from his position. Right now, as we are speaking, what is the feeling around Ruben Amorim and how secure is he in that position?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. The feeling within Manchester United is still to back Ruben Amorim, so he has that board support, but it's Manchester United. And if you have 3 or 4 bad games in a row, things can obviously change very quickly. So I think there's a few points here. The first is that within the Manchester United hierarchy, my understanding is they feel they've built a team good enough to at worst qualify for European football, and in the best case scenario to contend for top 4 or top 5 in the Champions League. So with the summer support, even though a midfielder didn't arrive, comes extra pressure simply because of the fact that if you're going to spend that amount of money and bring forward some of the budget from summer 2026, then the manager needs to deliver results. I'm not so sure, based on sources I speak to, that this is quite a Graham Potter West Ham type situation where there's 3 games between now and the international break in October and somehow results have to turn around, otherwise there'll be another managerial change. But what I do think is that if we get towards the festive period, if the season progresses, whether short term or medium term, and they're not on course for top 5, top 6, Europa League at worst, then Ruben Amorim is going to be under pressure. And it's one thing saying they back him now, and that is the Manchester United position. But definitely as the games go by, if they keep putting in performances like they do in the Manchester derby, if they don't get a good result against Chelsea at the weekend, then the pressure is definitely going to grow on Ruben Amorim. And that, of course, forces clubs to succession plan. The other thing worth noting is just the compensation, which at the moment, if Amorim decides, were he to be relieved of his duties, that he was going to insist on it, would be 12 million. If you get past the first year anniversary, that number goes down. Then we should note Ruben Amorim has said publicly, if Manchester United don't want him, he'll walk away without compensation. We'll have to wait and see if that scenario emerges, whether he's true to his word. But I think right now there is that genuine board backings. They're not succession planning. They're not interviewing. It's not Chelsea or bust or results between now and the international break. But once we maybe get 10, 15 games in, if Ruben Amorim is not showing, regardless of any mitigating circumstances, that this team can contend for some kind of European football, then I do think he'll be in big trouble.
Yeah, I mean, it's 10 months in and results really do need to start to pick up. I mean, 8 wins in 31 Premier League games, 4 only being against successive Premier League sides from last season to this season. Things have to change, and despite the fact that the Manchester United are putting the message out that they are fully behind the manager, I think internally they will be having some thoughts around whether this is going to turn around, and they'll definitely be doubting the situation right now. You have to be looking at the results. I think everybody wants it to work. Everybody wants Ruben Amorim to be successful, but the results do have to come. I know you speak towards the festive period there, and I know you can't really pinpoint it exactly. But for example, which we don't want to happen, but if it did, which is plausible with the track record we've got, if we did lose against Chelsea, Brentford away was a loss, and then that Sunderland game you don't get a result either, do you think going into that international break that there would be questions, or do you really think it does depend on the 1-year anniversary because of the fee and the compensation fee they'd have to pay?
Yeah, we'd have to understand with the compensation whether or not potentially Ruben Amorim would be prepared to waive it. And if he's true to his word and does so, that wouldn't be a factor. But right now, I think it's just a case of waiting. So Manchester United and Ruben Amorim can have a little bit more time, because obviously we've had a situation where he's had his first pre-season. He's had the opportunity in that pre-season to work with players for the first time. He's had, excuse me.
Bless you.
I've just got a little bit of a Munich plane bug, so apologies if I'm spluttering and stuttering, a bit like Manchester United at the moment, it has to be said. But yeah, I think it's that first pre-season, and it's the fact that Mason Mount and Matheus Cunha have been injured. Benjamin Sesko has needed some time to bed in. And then, of course, Senne Lammens at the moment is not the number one, but is expected to be sooner rather than later. So I think there's that feeling that Amorim still deserves a little bit of time to build this kind of project. But maybe we'll get in a situation where if results simply don't turn, that hand will be forced.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. Obviously, injuries occur to all teams. I know Cunha was a big signing for his. Mount is rarely ever available sustainably to be fit and starting anyway, so I don't really take that into consideration. And then the goalkeeper and the Sesko thing, that was their decision. Whether it was mutually agreed or it was one party pushing it more than the other, their decision was to go down that route. So in that area, I have little sympathy, unless Ruben Amorim was really behind the scenes saying, no, we need to go and get the proof and we need to go and get it now, which he might well have been, but we are not 100% privy to them conversations. So despite whatever circumstances we're in now in terms of injuries, in terms of the players being available, that squad is better than where we've been and where we are. So things do need to change. But, I mean, there's already a super chat in from King Ragnar in here saying, please ask Ben if Carrick is a genuine target for us if Amorim is sacked. If he is, how high is he on the list? Is there any names that are linked to Manchester United if Ruben Amorim does go? I don't often like speaking about this while a manager is still in situ, but I know a lot of people in the viewers who are viewing this do want to know if Manchester United do have a succession plan if that was to happen.
Yeah, there'll always be an element of succession planning simply because that's what well-run clubs do. And if you have the season like Manchester United did last campaign and then you don't get off to a positive start, come either the October international break or obviously the festive period, you have to start thinking about what if, because it's Manchester United and you can't leave a manager who's not gaining the progress that you're looking for. But to be clear, succession planning and interviewing are two different things.
Yeah.
So with the succession planning, I don't think it will be a Michael Carrick, or some had suggested prior to his return to Benfica, Jose Mourinho. These are not names that I'm hearing. Many of the names that they appreciate date back to the original process when they hired Ruben Amorim, but of course they were looking at other names. One of those is Gareth Southgate, that was widely reported at the time. I'm not aware yet as to whether he's ready to dive back into club management, but we know that he was definitely discussed, and that was specifically something that Jim Ratcliffe was driving. Oliver Glasner, Marco Silva, Thomas Frank, again unavailable because he's gone to Tottenham. These are names that all formulated part of the process the first time around. Even Luis Enrique was discussed, but obviously is very happy at PSG. So I think there's a wide array of names because at that point they were still building their sporting structure. So there was an element of inconsistency towards the hiring process because you went from Ten Hag, Vito within the recruitment model, FA Cup, stayed, went, Ruben Amorim, different recruitment model, no Vito. He's very forthright. It's collaborative. Dan Ashworth came, left, Ineos people like Jean-Claude Blanc coming, being involved, giving up his directorship, and then finally settling upon, at the moment anyway, Christopher Vivell, Jason Wilcox, and ultimately Omar Barada. So I think this time around, if they make a change, they'll have more of a what is our project, what is our style, what is our identity. And that's what makes it so tricky, because Ruben Amorim hasn't yet built an identity. He's not yet got the best out of these players in a 3-4-3 system. So they'll have to decide, are they still trying to build on what Amorim has put together? So then you've got to stick with your principles and your signings, or alternatively, are they going to throw it all away? And then you've almost got a carte blanche, because anyone can come in and go, well, the formation wasn't working, the culture wasn't working, the players were not working. And then suddenly what you've got and the ingredients completely different, because you can bring back a Kobbie Mainoo into midfield in a different system. You can decide that the 2 10s signed don't have to play as 10s. Cunha could go wide left. Bruno Fernandes could get more freedom. So these are the tough considerations because they've not got a clear enough identity. They've either got to stick with it, which means that Amorim either needs time or the Amorim replacement needs to be in the Amorim mode, or they've got to throw it all away, which means you could make a change sooner, but then you're building from square one for the third time since Sir Jim Ratcliffe has come in. So it's a difficult decision to make. And I sense because they haven't yet got enough building blocks and identity and fit, that's partially why they want to stick with Amorim to see whether he can actually get the best out of what he's got, because that will be the first clear indication that this not just manager, but ownership and recruitment model is actually working. If they make another change now and it's new manager, new formation, and they're back to square one, then you're in a situation where they've not learned any lessons. And it's the same as it's always been since Sir Alex Ferguson, where the manager gets scapegoated, new person comes in, perhaps a completely new idea, formation, system, culture. And once again, you get some happy players, some unhappy players, but it breeds a culture where your more senior players, if they're out of favour, perhaps are prepared to wait a manager out, because 9 times out of 10, the players have outlasted the manager. And that's supposedly what Sir Jim Ratcliffe is trying to move away from.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And you spoke right there. I was going to come to you next on that about the formation. And some people think the formation isn't a huge deal. Some people think it is the be all and end all. And it's interesting that you mentioned Oliver Glasner then, because obviously he does play the same formation that Ruben Amorim goes with, slightly different, but the same formation. He's a specialist in that. And I've had friends message me and say, you know, people are talking about Manchester United's midfield and he needs a certain midfielder to work in his system. And Oliver Glasner's making it work with Will Hughes and Adam Wharton, and obviously both very good players, but they seem to play it in such a good way where everybody seems to know what they're doing to a T. And it's Ruben Amorim's been here for quite a period of time now. He's got international players, he's got good players. Okay, they might not be the perfect players, and you just need to see it more. You need to see the results on the pitch. So many fans will applaud some of the work he's done off the pitch, myself included, and so many of the fans will agree with what you've just said there. We don't want to do the new manager cycle. We don't want to keep having this hamster wheel going of a new manager, a new formation, a new squad, bin it all and start again. We want to be able to stick with someone and see long-term results. But also at the same time, you can't be in the bottom half of the table. And that's where Manchester United have been under Ruben Amorim. And, you know, even looking at that Premier League table since he came in, of being bottom of Premier League teams since the game he took over, like there's been, you know, 6th with Rangnick and thinking it's the end of the world, and then there's been bottom of the Premier League team. So I really hope for our sake as fans that it does turn around and that Sir Jim does, you know, get his wish of having their guy and the manager that can make us successful into European football. But it's pretty difficult to see right now. I mean, just on the future, because there's a lot spoken about the finances of Ruben Amorim, sacking him and replacing him, or the finances going into January and summer in terms of the transfers. We do have a super chat in here from Rob Always United saying, Beth, how does Ben think our financial statement impacts the future? So you've seen obviously Manchester United's financial statement come out yesterday. There's been a lot of reports surrounding it. How do you think that affects what we're going to do or spend going into future windows, and, you know, with Manchester United potentially missing out on Champions League football or gaining it this season?
Yeah, I think getting Champions League football will help heading into the following financial year, because the money obviously reflects into the next season, but qualifying allows you to kind of project and know that that money is coming. So you might choose in a 3-year cycle to spend some money next summer, because you know in the following cycle, when the new financial year drops on and you do have your Champions League football, that it will all kind of add up. And that's the sort of beauty of PSR, that you lose a year and you gain a year on a rolling 3-year cycle. So getting Champions League not only means that in that following financial year, not the one we're in now, you put that money into your 3-year cycle. But obviously, if you get Champions League football, then in this case for Manchester United, because they've got no Europa League final to try and win, it will mean a top 4 or top 5 finish. So you'll get a fair amount more Premier League prize money as well that you can put on the books. Generally, looking at the last statement, I think it shows you that Manchester United, the brand, and Manchester United, the club, can still make money even without on-field success. So they'll be looking at those numbers. I think, in quite an encouraging light. Record revenue of 666.5 million for the fiscal year 2025, an operating loss of 18.4, which shouldn't be ignored, but is still down from a previous operating loss that was closer to 70 million. And if, in addition, they don't sack another manager, you can look at them as almost being break even. Because if you take that 18.4 operating loss and then you look at Erik ten Hag and his staff contributed to 36.6 million in so-called exceptional costs. That wasn't all Ten Hag, but a large proportion was. If they didn't have to change the manager, the operating loss basically would have been somewhere near zero. So if they replicate that year, even again without Champions League football, and they stick with Ruben Amorim and they don't have to pay their 12 million in compensation, then maybe you get a situation once again where they feel that the operating loss is somewhere close to zero, which I think will be the aim. And then suddenly you start to think financially they've got a little bit more leeway. As we've discussed on previous shows, the financial year that dropped off had quite heavy amortization. And this is why I think Manchester United in part were able to spend more than they originally budgeted over the summer. And then if you flash forwards, there's a possibility of Bruno Fernandes to Saudi, which I still think we'll be talking about a lot in 12 months' time. Casemiro potentially leaving and his wage coming off the books too. So there will be a way, I sense, where Manchester United can spend, and quite healthily, on multiple players again next summer. And this is why, as I've said many times, and we discussed it on the last show, might not just be one midfielder, it might be two potentially that come in 2026, whether that's January or whether that's next summer. So there was a lot to like from Manchester United's perspective with the financial report, but it shows you that this brand and this club and this new stadium and all the things that are the trappings around the football can and have always, even since Alex Ferguson functioned, the Snapdragon front of shirt sponsorship was another contributing factor because it was the first full season of it. But none of that matters if you can't actually get your football team in order. And for me, it was very telling yesterday that these numbers are quite positive, and yet by the end of the day, the stock price had dropped by 6%, because I think there's a feeling amongst investors, even with the modernisation, even with Jim Ratcliffe, even with Carrington, and even with all of these nice commercial deals that keep Manchester United on a firm footing, if they can't get it right on the field, if they can't get back into Champions League football regularly, if they keep changing their manager, the club is kind of stuck in this everlasting cycle post Sir Alex Ferguson of needing change because everything might be right with the brand, but there's so much work still to do with the football club. So I think they'll be fine to spend in 2026, but it's kind of about allocating that money smartly and rightly. And I think the big change under Ruben Amorim is the fact that with Erik ten Hag, the veto meant effectively in recruitment that he could step in and say, no, it doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for my system. It doesn't work for what I want at this football club. And he had too much control. Now, actually, the pressure is on Amorim, but the project and what they're building and what formation effectively they're buying for and the culture, that's now on Christopher Vivell and Jason Wilcox and Omar Barada. And they can sign without Amorim's permission because it's kind of a collaborative system, which is why Ollie Watkins was Amorim's choice. They debated it. They went for Benjamin Sesko. And I think that is a very underrated point, that this is no longer a manager that has the same autonomy as Erik ten Hag had. And maybe that's why Amorim is speaking from the heart so often. Maybe that's why he's so frustrated at times. Maybe that's why he's giving us maybe too much of his mind for Manchester United's leadership's liking, because he is so open and free with how he speaks in press conferences. And part of that is because he's battling internally himself, which is quite healthy in some ways. But it's not just on the manager now to get this right. It's on everybody at the club, because the recruitment team are more accountable than ever, especially compared to when Erik ten Hag was there, for who comes through the door.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, and it's interesting because it just flagged something up that I remembered in his press conference post the Manchester derby, and he said something along the lines of, I won't quote him for exact just in case it is, a little bit off the mark, but it was something along the lines of, you don't know what's happened these last months, basically, behind the scenes, it seemed like he was saying that like you don't know what's happened that you haven't seen, as in talking to like the journalists and maybe the fans, and maybe that's why it's been a difficult situation to get through this. And I was struggling to kind of understand or interpret what he was alluding to there. I was thinking, was he alluding to decisions in the transfer window off the pitch? Is he alluded to the culture that he walked into at Manchester United and how poor it was and how much he actually had to change it? It was interesting to kind of think to myself what he was alluding to there. It seemed like there was something that has gone on that people don't know about that he's had to deal with, maybe.
Yeah, I think there's a few things coming in to a job that, remember, he didn't want at the time. He wanted to wait until this summer. So that's one factor, that he immediately walk into a house full of flames and can't put them out in that first season. But as you can imagine, if Manchester United had found an interim solution and then this summer was day one of Ruben Amorim, we wouldn't be having any of these conversations. We'd be talking about time and patience and some bad luck with injuries and a lot of outgoings and turnover. And I think everyone would say, okay, he's got some time now to really get everyone's click in this system. The challenge is we haven't really seen the system click and work. And he's had 10 months. And even though there have been some new players and some injuries, the vast majority of the senior players have been there and have been fit. So obviously he has to find a way of proving that this can work or adapting. And the fact that there is no adaptation, there is no flexibility. He said, if you want to change the philosophy, you change the manager. So he's making it very clear that it's the Amorim way or the highway. And I think that aspect had a kind of similarity at Carrington with Erik ten Hag, who was also seen amongst the players as firm but fair and immovable at times. And we know that that led to a fallout with Marcus Rashford and Jadon Sancho and Antony. And I think Ruben Amorim, in a sort of strange way, has gone through a very similar path. Particularly, I'm told, with Antony, who I think, as we said on a previous show, I was told a lot of Manchester United players felt Antony would have been a good player to keep. He would have been a good fit for this system. And that if he was given maybe some opportunities and maybe Manchester United came back to the player and said, why not Manchester United? He might have actually changed his position, but it never happened. And I think that that's not necessarily on Amorim, but it's definitely the case that Antony knew when Amorim arrived that he was out in the cold. And then this summer, it was immediately, you're not coming back when the other players are coming back. You're not part of the first team squad. And now we obviously know that he's left and he's off to Betis. So there's a few players like that, both ones that have left and others that are still there, that have lost a little bit of faith, because whereas maybe they appreciate the philosophy is rigid, they expect a bit more one-on-one management to try and make sure that there's no professional tension, that everyone feels they're getting a fair chance. And as with Ten Hag, who was accused of being a bit boot campy in the way that he dealt with everybody, it was always a group, it was always in public, it was often raising the voice, it was often quite aggressive, it was often very firm. I think Ruben Amorim is also quite no nonsense, and there's a few players, some that have gone and some that are still there, that maybe feel a softer touch is needed, and also a more analytical touch is needed too. And the latter is really important, because if you're not learning the system in practice and then you're basically just being given instructions and told to do it in training, the other way of learning the system is obviously more one-on-one work, singling players aside, making sure that you have a lot of meetings, showing them a lot of video evidence. And a lot of that, from what I gather, is either not happening or is not directly happening through Ruben Amorim. So there are a few players for sure that feel there needs to be a bit more of a connection directly between manager and player on a one-on-one level. Largely speaking, the dressing room supports Amorim, and some of the senior players, such as Harry Maguire and Bruno Fernandes, are pointing back and directly addressing the group and saying to these players, it's not just the system, it's not the manager. we're underperforming, we're making bad game management decisions and so on. But there are other players there, from what I'm told, that feel that the manager can go out of his own comfort zone and be a little bit more genial and do a little bit more one-on-one and bring in a bit more evidence, data evidence, science evidence, video evidence, rather than just pouring it all out on the training field and assuming that repetition is the way to actually learning this system. So, we can't really fault Amorim in the sense he did the same at Sporting with great success and it worked, but every club is different. And I think maybe Ruben Amorim, during these two international breaks, the one we've had and the one coming up, is starting to learn that if he's not going to adapt his philosophy, he is going to have to change a little bit his man management behind closed doors. And let's see whether in the next few weeks we get a bit of a shift and a change in that dynamic.
Well, that's some really great insight then there, and you kind of already got into the point that I was going to move on to next, which is brilliant, and it's good to kind of know that knowledge about how the players are feeling, and that kind of comes off the back of a super chat that we've got in saying, my question is, why can't Ben Ben's not on the training field, why can't Amorim push his players to play with intensity for 90 minutes? It's not about the system, but the players are not running enough. And it's interesting actually, because I've been watching, I watch football every single week, but I was watching Atletico Madrid last night and I just thought, wow, this is like the intensity, the amount of running, and from minute one till the end, even though they were 2-0 down, within, I don't know, what was it, 10 minutes, maybe even less than that. And I thought that willingness to continually fight in such a hostile atmosphere when you were already way up against it, against one of the best teams in Europe and Premier League winners, I thought, wow, that is some players with some seriously good mentality and some great work ethic. And that's something I think that is massively missing from this Manchester United team. I don't know if it's a subconscious thing, whether it's a lack of belief, but whenever anything goes against us in a game, it feels like heads drop, that belief kind of goes down, and there's not as much intensity in the way that the players go out there. And I always look back at the manager for that. So just to kind of touch on what you were just saying again, you would say the full dressing room, the majority of it is behind Amorim, but there was reports about the players maybe feeling it's a little bit too rigid, Bruno Fernandes perhaps not being too happy in a deeper role, and there's been so much talk about that. Is there anything else in there that you can maybe give us surrounding maybe Bruno Fernandes and his role, and whether maybe other people in and around the football club might think that is something that Ruben Amorim should change?
Yeah, Bruno Fernandes is obviously really important. And remember, when he signed his new long-term deal, there was a direct conversation between him and several members of Manchester United's leadership to effectively make sure that they were on the same page. And then again this summer, when Bruno Fernandes was approached by 3 different PIF-owned clubs, but the real push from Al Hilal in the early part of the window, Fernandes again wanted to stay, and he sought guarantees that him and the club were on the same page. But I think it was obvious that if Cunha and Bumo are both 10s and they are to be utilised in that position, even if they end up filtering wide or in Cunha's case playing as a number 9, Bruno Fernandes, as you say, has to play a little bit deeper. And that presents a really interesting scenario, because Fernandes from deep will still fulfil a kind of midfield metronome role, or off the ball will be naturally inclined to break forwards. So what you get is Fernandes deep, slowing the ball down and trying to pick his pass. And actually Manchester United in that system, if you look at the Manchester derby, having more possession than Manchester City and more time on the ball. But if you're doing that and you're getting 55% of the ball, there's a fair chance that you're not pressing, you're not as intense, because those kind of sides tend to be the ones that do really well in transition and hit sides on the counter-attack. And the lack of perhaps legs through the centre and a deep Bruno Fernandes with Manuel Ugarte has them caught, I think, between these two styles of, do they surrender less of the ball and are more intense? And then you need legs and ball winners and to catch people in transition. And if you win it, you would think that Fernandes and Burmo, Shesko, Cunha, Ahmad would all be very devastating. Even the likes of Mazraoui and Dorgu pushing forwards from wide areas. But they haven't shown themselves to be particularly clinical in transition, or they have more of the ball, but then you need to be able to turn that into meaningful chances, and we've seen a lack of kind of quality and service into the box. And I think that's where maybe Bruno Fernandes is getting a little bit more frustrated, because he's so used to hovering fluidly in and around the edge of the area and having the ability to link up everything. But what we're seeing at times is him and Ahmad, him and Mbeumo, Cunha when he's played as 9, kind of fighting for the same sort of space. So this is where they're going to have to work out exactly their defined roles. And it may be that Bruno has to be a little bit more rigid if he's playing alongside a fit Cunha and Mbeumo, and presuming that it's Šeško leading the line. So having sort of learned the system one way, you're now having to relearn the system and factor in all these new signings. And I think that's maybe why Amorim will be given a bit more time, because this isn't only since day one have they learned the system. This is now incorporate Mbeumo, Cunha and Šeško into your front line, which means, as you say, pushing Bruno Fernandes back deeper. So there's a lot of people in that final third that have either got a new role because they're new to the club, or a change role because of who's come into the club. And that, again, is why I think it's not clicking. But I did find it interesting in the Manchester derby. You know, you go away at Manchester City and you have more of the ball than them, and actually over 55% of possession, but they just didn't make it count. And I wonder whether, as time passes in this formation, if it is to work, if it might be better to have less of the ball and press, as you say, in a more intense way, bring legs in the centre of the park and become a team that catches opponents more in transition rather than just tries to control the rhythm of the game.
I think you make a good point in terms of not being able to do anything with the ball when we actually have it, or make it count, as you would say, stick the ball in the back of the net. I think one of the things that I picked up on in that derby especially, but I've been looking at since the season began, is the wing-backs get the ball a lot in our attacking third and responsible for creating a lot of the chances, and the output is just, in my opinion, not good enough. And you're asking the likes of Dorgu and Mazraoui, who are good players, but they're not the likes of a Gakpo, a Salah, a Saka, an Eze, you know, to be creating them quality opportunities for you. And I remembered back in the summer when you spoke about Ruben Amorim maybe pushing for a left wing back or looking at the wing back spots. I think that's a really important part of his system that's been a little bit neglected. Is that something that Ruben Amorim did want to add reinforcements to, and something that maybe Ineos will take into consideration moving into the next window?
Yeah, we spoke during the summer about Pervis Estupiñán, who went to Milan, and Manchester United were there in part, although I'm not aware they made a formal bid. Dorgu is very liked. Lyon as well is a player that I think Manchester United think has got a big future ahead of him. But you've got this sort of classic project future long-term versus a manager that knows he has to win now. And you're right to flag that not enough is being, at the moment, got out of those fullbacks or wing-backs. And that is in part, I think, down to the fact that if you're not dominating through the centre, and if you're susceptible to big spaces and being caught in transition, it's harder for these wing backs to really overcommit and get forwards, because they're either having to invert in order to cover space and stop a transition, or if they go forwards and then before receiving the ball, it's lost in the centre of the park, you're leaving big spaces, and it becomes very easy to pick Manchester United apart at the moment in wide areas. So that comes down to the confidence again. And it may be that a tweak is potentially to look at how Man City lined up in more of a 4-1-4-1 formation. In that kind of formation, you would think that Cunha or Mbeumo, one of them would have to go wide, and then you'd have two behind Šeško, Bruno Fernandes, and whoever you pick as the other number 10. It would probably mean Mason Mount goes out of the side in that kind of formation. But the advantage of the 4-1-4-1 formation instead of the 3-4-3 formation is the fact that one midfielder is giving you, and I know it's a Ballon d'Or winner in Rodri for Man City, so not everyone's just got them in their back pocket, but they're giving you protection, they're giving you legs, they're able to sort of single-handedly offer the protection. And then if, like Manchester United showed in the Manchester derby, you got more of the ball, you can build forward slowly, and in that back four, you can get your two wing-backs forwards, knowing that you've got a kind of triangle in midfield. So it was Renders, Foden, and I think Rodri for Manchester City. And what they do really well is they squeeze out the centre of the park in quite a flat three, when they're not in the ball. And then when they are on the ball, one is the sort of pivot or the metronome in Rodri, and the other two have license to burst forwards. And I think with Manchester United, we're not really seeing, ironically, because they were both signed for this, two 10s in traditional 10 form. So in that 4-1-4-1 formation, you've got Foden and one other, depending on who he picks, that really are advanced 8s or 10s. They're very central. They're quite close together. They're not forced out wide, particularly because, for example, Doku was there on one side. And if Haaland drops deeper, both of those players can push forwards. Whereas if you look at the 3-4-3 with Manchester United, it's a much bigger gap between Bruno, Diallo and Šeško. There's not as much link-up play. And if anything, Bruno Fernandes or Ugarte on the ball are trying to get into that central area, but really only up to where an 8 would play. And then the 10s are getting forced into wide areas. And when they're there, there's not much overlap support from the fullbacks, and they can't really get into the box either. And eventually you just get no service and no connection. So I think regardless of what the formation is that Ruben Amorim fields, and it looks like he's going to stick with a 3-4-3, the two behind Šeško are obviously the most important players. And they're not really acting or performing or getting the goal contributions of 10s at the moment. Once they get that sorted, their movement, their positional play, hopefully things will start to click. But it is kind of ironic that you sign two 10s, by definition, even if they're versatile, you add Bruno Fernandes and you've got Mason Mount. So the 10 position, whether it is 10, second striker, advanced 8, whatever, it should be Manchester United's strongest position. And even an injury to Cunha shouldn't change that, because there's a lot of different options, but we're not seeing any real output yet from whoever's in that 10 role. And regardless of what the formation is, that needs to change.
Yeah, so a few of the viewers that are watching right now says get Ben on the coaching staff. We'd love to see it. I really like that.
Worse than now, trust me.
I like the idea that you put forward and giving Manchester City as a reference to that. Pep Guardiola's so good at making little adjustments to make things click in that way. And obviously we know Rodri is a fantastic player. Reinders is a great signing, but we have our own midfielder that a lot of Man United fans feel like should be getting more game time in Kobbie Mainoo, who I'm going to come to in just a second. But speaking of Manchester City, we have got so much coverage for you guys on That's Football coming up through the week and the weekend, so make sure you head over there, turn on notifications after this video. Tonight you've got, Champions League on a Thursday. You've got to love that. I wish we were in it, but it's Newcastle versus Barcelona at St James's, and then Man City versus Napoli, Højlund and McTominay back in Manchester. Both watch-alongs on That's Football. Make sure you head across to that. Friday night, you know what time it is. It's Bundesliga live, watching the game, and with Goldbridge's commentary. You've got to get onto that. And then such a big weekend of Premier League football. Liverpool-Everton will be the watch-along on the Saturday. Then you've got also Man United-Chelsea, Old Trafford on the United stand on Saturday. And then you've got Super Sunday with Arsenal and City. Sunday night. So you've got to get your notifications on. I'll be there the whole way. But parking that, coming back to Manchester United, Ben, and we've got some super chats coming in that I want to ask you in a second. But Kobbie Mainoo, it's a big one that I've wanted to get onto. There was reports put out there that Newcastle might test Manchester United's resolve on Kobbie Mainoo in January. Eddie Howe's a big fan of the player. There was a little bit of talk in the summer about him. You've mentioned Newcastle being admirers on the show before. Is there still something in that? Is Kobbie Mainoo still unsettled? And could you see a possibility where Newcastle come in for him, or maybe other teams? I think even Man City have been linked, which I couldn't see, but an update on that would be great.
Yeah, I can't see Kobbie Mainoo going to Man City. I can't see Man United sanctioning that either. The Kobbie Mainoo links with Newcastle are not new, as you say, and I would term Newcastle and Chelsea as both having a historical interest in Kobbie Mainoo. But I'm not aware that anything is developing for January, because Sean Longstaff went to Leeds United. Newcastle are inclined to add one more midfielder, and it would also give them the possibility potentially of Joe Linton playing in a more advanced role. So it could be one to watch, and Napoli still might be there for Kobbie Mainoo as well. But Manchester United's position hasn't changed. They don't want to sell Kobbie Mainoo, and they'd be less inclined to do that in the middle of the season anyway. So I think both Mainoo and Manchester United's focus is, can they get some kind of minutes and output and confidence out of him between now and when the January window opens? And neither Manchester United nor Mainoo now are looking for a move away. But if the January window opens and nothing changes for Kobbie Mainoo, then I expect him to double down. And I expect him to once again tell Manchester United that he wants to go out somewhere on loan. Loan is difficult because naturally Manchester United see the other two extremes as more viable, that he either signs a new deal, their preference, or alternatively they sell him and they get pure profit on the books. And I think Mainoo is very much going to be driving this one, if anything is to happen in January, and potentially with a view to the fact it's 6 months away from the World Cup. Because Manchester United don't seem, from what I gather, that confident that many of their top midfield targets are going to be available in January. So it's not impossible that they add one. But if you look at who the names are, the likes of Carlos Baleba, summer only, Adam Wharton, summer only, Angelo Stiller, release clause in the summer, and several other targets that have been reported, not many of them are going to be available in the month of January. And I think Manchester United's perspective is not to let Kobbie Mainoo go unless they can bring another midfielder through the door first. And only if the player says once again, as he did in the final days of the window, he wants out. So this is really all on the player now. Ruben Amorim is hoping for a response. He's hoping that Kobbie Mainoo can improve and click within this system. And obviously, if you're Kobbie Mainoo, you might wait and see what happens with the manager also between now and the January period before deciding what you want to do. Because I've said it many times, in an ideal world, but he has to think practically, but in an ideal world, Mainoo wants to stay at Manchester United. Mainoo wants to extend. Mainoo wants to be playing. But you hit a point where if that's not happening, you have to start looking away because a footballer's life is short. And exactly the same thing happened to Mason Mount at Chelsea, where for a whole year, he wanted to sign. He wanted to stay. He was a Cobham graduate. But it got to the point where he was frozen out. Club and player couldn't get on the same page. And then eventually he obviously left for Manchester United. I think Mainoo is exactly the same, that of course he wants to play. Of course he wants to make it work. Of course he's somewhat encouraged by the fact that Manchester United didn't sanction an exit, even though he wanted to play more regularly in a World Cup year. But if we get towards January and the situation hasn't improved, then I can see Kobbie Mainoo again agitating to go and get game time somewhere simply because it's 6 months before a World Cup. And then again, Manchester United will have to decide, are they prepared to sanction an exit? And are they specifically prepared to sanction a loan? And I don't think Manchester United's position will change on a loan. I'd be surprised if they sanction that mid-season. So we're back again at the two extremes of Mainoo fighting his way into this system, and then it would lead to a new deal, or Mainoo being sold for pure profit. And I sense if the latter's to happen, like with Mason Mount, we'll be talking about it more in summer 2026 rather than January. And then in terms of the clubs, we'll have to wait and see. Newcastle haven't made an approach. Newcastle haven't yet spoken to Mainoo. Their interest is historical. There's no guarantee that Newcastle could even give Kobbie Mainoo in a three-man midfield any more game time at the moment than he's getting at Manchester United. But I think Napoli are the other club to watch because they're keen and they may be willing to do something potentially with a loan plus an obligation to buy if Manchester United become open to that kind of structure. But it wouldn't surprise me unless the player really pushes in January, if we're talking more about Mainoo's future, whether extending or being sold, come summer 2026 rather than January.
And now always looking at it, and I think if Napoli are interested, there's something going wrong at the club of how are you not making this player work, because Scott McTominay, the way he's taken off at Napoli, and Antonio Conte is just a fantastic manager who can get the best out of players. I mean, Rasmus Højlund is yet to be seen. I know he scored a goal on his debut and you can't get carried away with it, but I hope he ends up having a really good time there and excelling his own career there as well, because it does feel like a lot of players that leave Manchester United, especially, you know, with the likes of teams where you've got a great manager like Conte, there is potential in the player. And so many of the fans, I think that's where the fans are getting their backs up a little bit. Not that it's player over manager, because it's not, but people don't know how long Amorim's going to be here or if he's even going to be successful. We don't want to lose out on such a good player like Kobbie Mainoo off the back of that. And it was interesting, Kobbie Mainoo, the way Amorim described him and how he's competing with Manu Ugarte, how he's competing with Casemiro and mainly Bruno Fernandes. But as fans, you see Ugarte have a fair few unfortunately, poor performances. And it's like, well, Kobbie Mainoo maybe isn't getting that same chance. Bruno Fernandes, as much as we love him, he's 90 minutes every single game, no matter what. And it's when is Kobbie going to get his opportunities is what a lot of fans would be asking. So we'll see. Chelsea, maybe. We thought when Cunha and Mount were out that he would feature in the derby. Still didn't get a start, which I think for Kobbie Mainoo is a little bit frustrating. And also you're thinking to yourself, wow, where is my place? Cunha and Mount are both out and I still can't get a start. It is discouraging. So let's see how it plays out.
Yeah, I think also it's kind of worth pointing out that Amorim has said publicly, as you allude to, that Kobbie Mainoo needs to kind of work on his speed of movement or speed of thought. And what we know is that Amorim wants athleticism in the middle of the park. He doesn't have it at the moment. So he almost has to find a pairing that complement each other. And like I said before, the ability potentially for the fullbacks to cover and cut into central areas as well, to give Manchester United that extra cover and the legs and the athleticism. And for whatever reason, Mainoo Ugarte is not a pairing because of their collective speed of thought and movement that Ruben Amorim thinks is going to work. And then you look at Napoli again, and like I said before, sound a bit like a broken record now. What's their formation? It's 4-1-4-1. And I think if you took Kobbie Mainoo in a 4-1-4-1, you move Bruno Fernandes forwards in a 4-1-4-1, you'd have the ability to put Mbeumo or Cunha in a wide area in a 4-1-4-1. I watched Napoli's game against Fiorentina when Rasmus Højlund scored. He's leading the line in that formation as well. Kevin De Bruyne, who's lost a bit of pace, but not speed of thought, is thriving in that area as well. So you feel like Bruno would be able to too. But it's really easy to just sit in an armchair and say that. This 3-4-3.
That's what we do on here, Ben.
Yeah, but this 3-4-3 formation is not going to move. It's not going to change. It's not going to suddenly become a back four, because I think Ruben Amorim is living or dying on his back three. He's living or dying on this culture he's building and on this formation. And he's hoping that it just suddenly clicks and pays off. And there should be no reason, like I said before, why the two behind the striker in this formation can't thrive in that 10 role. They've just got to find a way of not competing for the same space. They've got to find a way of getting goal contributions, and they've got to find a way of recovering when they lose the ball. Because I think the other big gaping hole at the moment is the fact that regardless of what that front three do, if they push forwards and lose it, it's so easy to pick Manchester United apart through the centre at the moment. And I think Ruben Amorim is probably making that point as well, that he's one box office elite starting midfielder away from this system working. But for whatever reason, he doesn't think that he's got it from within, and he doesn't think that the answer to the problem is Kobbie Mainoo. So let's see if he gets an opportunity against Chelsea, but I'd be surprised.
Last but not least, Ben, maybe looking ahead to the Chelsea game, Senne Lammens. We said on the last show that you thought he was going to be considered the number one quite quickly, but you expected maybe Bayern still to start in the derby as he's eased in. Yeah. Do you think Senne Lammens might get an opportunity on Saturday? I mean, how quick do you think he could be put in there? Yeah,
Senne Lammens is impressing behind the scenes. A lot of the players feel that he's ready-made for the Premier League. We said on the last show, there's two goalkeepers from Belgium, Senne Lammens and Mike Penders, and a lot of people, not just within the clubs that they're at, but also within the wider industry, think these keepers are the real deal and think these goalkeepers are going to be box office within the Premier League. Let's see whether it's still one game or two games too soon. My expectation, I don't know, I'm not good at predicting team news, but my expectation is that once we pass the international break in October, Senne Lammens will be the number one for Manchester United week in, week out in the Premier League. Could come before, could come against Chelsea. But I think that Lammens has been signed as the number one, and he will be that number one sooner rather than later. So it could be Chelsea, but I definitely think after the international break on October the 18th, we'll be seeing more Lammens starts, and it will be obvious that this isn't two goalkeepers competing for the number one in Bayern and Lammens. This is Lammens as the Manchester United number one, to give him a run of games between now and January so they can assess is he actually Premier League ready? Because that is the feeling behind closed doors at Carrington. And then we might get good news with Matheus Cunha as well. So on the last show, I was saying how I was told from the point of injury to the point of return, it might be 4 or 5 weeks. So that would kind of push us towards the first week in October. But I was told a few days ago that Cunha's been working with a personal trainer. Cunha's been telling people that he's going to be ready for the Chelsea game in some capacity. Let's see if Ruben Amorim agrees. But I think that is going to be a really important boost if Cunha can get back. And hopefully his return will get Manchester United going. That'd
be brilliant. And Mount still a little bit away?
Yeah, I don't really know the situation with Mason Mount as much.
Keep it very quiet, I think.
To be honest with you, the prognosis isn't as obvious. As we said on the previous show, I don't think either injury is so serious that it's necessarily anything long-term to worry about. I'd be surprised if Mason Mount, for example, is out significantly beyond the October international break. He might even be back before it. But Cunha's one was a bit easier to predict. It was like best case 3 weeks, which might now be the case, and worst case kind of 5-6 weeks, which would take you into early or mid-October. But Cunha's kind of really been focused on one-on-one work to get back earlier than the original prognosis suggested. And speaking to those close to him, it wouldn't remotely surprise me if he does actually end up making the Chelsea squad.
I'd love it if he does. I think he was a miss in the derby, and I just want to see more of him play. I really like the way he conducts himself on the pitch. Thank you very much for that update, Ben. It's put a smile on my face, and I'm sure a lot of Manchester United fans as well. Just reading some super chats before we depart. Philemon says Nazari is not a good player, period. Sinoy San Xavi Hernandez in. And King Kangar says Iriola McKenna ? Obviously, Xavi Hernandez, Iriola and McKenna were not names you mentioned, Ben, but not too far into the succession planning as to go that far, maybe?
Kind of like McKenna was obviously a name that they genuinely did consider, but he signed a new deal at Ipswich Town. That would be a return to Manchester United. And I think at this stage, they are more inclined to go with somebody with a bit more Premier League or European experience if they make a change, just based upon the shortlist that was put together. There was more driven for Amorim by Barada and Jason Wilcox, whereas obviously the Eric Ten Hag review was kind of when Barada was just starting, and again Wilcox was new at the club. So I think those two have maybe made a bit of a shift in one or two of the names, and I think if they make a change, even though McKenna did brilliantly to get Ipswich those back-to-back promotions, he still ultimately brought them down into the Championship this season. And I would be surprised if he's as high on the list as maybe he was in the immediate aftermath of Eric Ten Hag getting sacked. I think you'd be looking at Southgate just because of the relationship with Sir Jim Ratcliffe, Marco Silva and Oliver Glasner, both of which are gettable. And Silva has a release clause baked into his contract as well. I would add Andoni Iraola, who I believe also still has a release clause. I think Bournemouth are trying to get him to sign a new deal and maybe change the terms of those release clause. But there'd be much more of a pattern, in my opinion, if, and again, it still is a massive if because they want it to work with Ruben Amorim. But if they make a change, I think there'll be more of a pattern and consistency to the shortlist. And I think several of the candidates, if they are to explore a change, might be ones that have current Premier League experience.
Thank you very much, Ben. It's been brilliant to chat with you again, and hopefully we're talking a bit more positively next week, and we've had a good win at home against Chelsea. Any predictions?
Well, I think it's a good time to play Chelsea because they've had to travel to Bayern. They've fielded a strong 11. There will be an element of rotation as a consequence. They're at home too, so they'll be hoping for a bit of a Champions League hangover. I think the problem for Manchester United is that Chelsea are devastating in transition, and they do have legs through the centre and in wide areas. And the idea of Agate, Bruno Fernandes against Moises Caicedo, Enzo Fernandez, it's hard to see how Chelsea are not going to boss it and dominate in the centre. And then, of course, Palmer always gets in the pocket and finds space as well. I've got a sneaky suspicion that Esteval Willian will start the game at Old Trafford too. And he's been on incredible form and is definitely one of these sort of prodigies and talents for the future. So they won't be able to afford any errors. I think it will be high scoring. And I'm going to predict 2-2.
2-2. I like it. I'd take a point. Sweet. That's where I've gone to. I'll take a point at Old Trafford. Look, Ben, thank you so much for all your amazing insight as usual. I have really enjoyed listening to you as per usual, and so has the viewers at home. So everybody, make sure you smash a like on the video, and remember all of the watch-alongs and content we have coming up this week on That's Football and the United Stand. We've got Premier League, we've got Champions League, we've got Bundesliga, and of course the big one is Manchester United against Chelsea on the United Stand at 5:30 kickoff. But there'll be loads of build-up happening throughout the day from the morning time really. There'll be road trips, there'll be countdown to kickoffs, there'll be watch-alongs, so make sure you stay tuned for all of that. But the last thing to say, Ben, is thank you very much again for your time, and we will see you on the next one.
Look forward to it. Speak next week.